up, gang? This is Rise showing you what the F is happening in America. So this past few weeks have definitely been full of headlines. Just wanted to start talking about the military meeting that our Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and the President had with a bunch of flag officers. Flag officers are generals and admirals in our military. And they all convened in Quantico, Virginia, over at the Marine Corps base in Quantico, um, to convene. And there were some very concerning things that were definitely brought up, and I'm just going to get right into it.
But I want to salute every service member who has helped us carry out this critical mission. It's really a very important mission. And I told Pete we should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military. We've brought back the fundamental principle that defending the homeland is the military's first and most important priority. That's what it is. Only in recent decades did politicians somehow come to believe that our job is to police the far reaches of Kenya and Somalia while America is under invasion from within. We're under invasion from within.
And that was something that he pretty much talked about during his campaign too, right? And it's like, who is that enemy? And you know, there's a lot to be said here because like a lot of there was a lot of concern about the military generals weren't necessarily receiving that message well, and like there was not a lot of excitement and applause because months ago the president was doing this type of like convening and rally over at a base. I can't recall which one it is, but months ago, and it was mainly enlisted folks. And now there is data to support this for sure about just like the differentiation between military personnel and like how they split ideologically, politically, right? Um, and so like I believe like with the generals though, you have a lot of examples in the past of some generals that were very much willing to, break and break with the president. It was General Mark Milley, who was the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is like the highest ranking military advisor that we have in our country. And like he was the one of the main few folks that was concerned about the January 6th incident, right? And started implementing programs on how to structure, you know, understanding just how diversity, equity, and inclusion should be playing a factor in how we make our military a force that is not only just willing to fight, but also one that thinks and is smarter, right? And he broke with the president. He had a very, very impassioned speech on we don't serve like have a loyalty oath to any person, any king, any main dictator, right? There is an oath to the Constitution. And so that's one thing uh that was one point of divergence. And there's just like a long history of generals who've actually been the clarion call force in countering administrative federal government policies, foreign policy that's just wrong, right? We even like as early as 2004, we had a general who his name was Wesley Clark, ran as a Democrat, and he, he kind of I'm definitely going to look him up for sure. But he was very he had a much different thought process than what you would traditionally think from like this group, right? And so the whole point of this meeting that they had in Quantico was just to talk through his intent on loyalty, right? And like the secretary, Pete Hegseth's speech right after that was just as inflamed, talking about trying to get the beardos and fat generals in shape to become a fighting force, a war fighting force, and like completely disregard the rules of engagement. So what they're looking for are people who are loyal only to the bottom line of the administration. And so what that looks like is becoming more and more terrifying. Um but going back to Wesley Clark, like there is a long history, a tradition of generals being very vocal against the forces of political power when it comes to the military integrity, right? And so Wesley Clark is one. I can also bring up Smedley Butler, who was a lieutenant general in the United States Marine Corps that wrote a book called War is a Racket and was very vocal about the influence that the military industrial complex has on the military at large. But I wanted to play this video of General Wesley Clark because again, this I don't think the administration is going to get the kind of response that they want from the generals because just, historically we've seen a lot who have spoken up against federal administrations when it came to a variety of different things. So here's General Wesley Clark.
After 9/11, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, don't show it to me."
Was on mute for a second. So that's an example of someone who just questioned authority right off of the bat, right? Like after 2001, the Bush administration had the intent to obviously go into Iraq, but there's also classified information that General Clark was receiving where he had to counter and ask like what is the plan? And is this going to be, you know, is this going to be what we put in place? And like he's asking basic questions. This eventually prompted General Clark to run for president in 2004 because he was a vocal opponent of the plan to attack 7 countries, right? And you know, there are so many. I mean, look at the way Iraq was conducted, right? The intent was to be in there for a short period of time to go and find weapons of mass destruction. The federal government was clearly lying, and like there's just a lot in that goes in with this type of leadership, right? And I do believe that the flag officers that were meeting in Quantico with the Secretary of Defense and the president do come from this line of thought. And talking about ideology and politics, like there's just a much more rooted firmness in flag officers being able to address these problems like and nip them at the bud. But that was just one example, like and that kind of it's an interesting perspective. And like like even when we had President Eisenhower in office, one of the things that he talked about was the influence of the military industrial complex as a Republican, right? So like the leadership, that perspective that comes from generals when it is inserted into politics and is concerned about politics usually is very counter to what that meeting was, because again, that was a full-fledged political rally rather than an actual, meeting and discussing the warrior ethos as was, described by whoever was inviting all these folks together and getting the press involved. And so I'm very interested in seeing, what's going to happen in terms of these generals that were at the meeting and were present, and how they're going to respond. The more they have to talk about, the more they have to hear about utilizing, cities across the country as training grounds to go and get rid of the enemy within. Because if there is an enemy within, and this is still kind of along the lines of, designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, right? Like this is starting to look more and more like the McCarthy era, and we're just utilizing words like Antifa as a catch-all to go and criminalize, prosecute, destroy, and and get rid of vocal opponents of this administration. So that's one thing. The other thing that happened this week was that there was a government shutdown. And so right now, like the White House has been warning that we're going to be losing $15 billion in GDP each week this shutdown happens. There's Russell Vought. He's the Office of Management and Budget Director. He's also one of the main architects of Project 2025. So this is the guy that's been executing a lot of the, goals of that Project 2025 mandate for leadership from the Heritage Foundation. So as it says here, the U.S. could lose 15 billion of its gross domestic product each week the shutdown extends, with a month-long shutdown leading to an additional 43,000 unemployed people. The Council of Economic Advisors warned in the memo. That damage does not account for the 1.9 federal civilian employees who are either furloughed or working without pay, 80% of whom live in the Washington area. So, like, this sphere of influence is very close to the administration. Um, and obviously, there was a lot of political theater around how we even got to that point. In order for them to fully get a funding bill passed in Congress, they needed 60 votes. Fell short of that. So this clearly is going to look like something that the administration is going to have a plan for. Every, probably just reconvening, getting their legislative power out there to go and reconvene folks every day and voting on it until, the Democrats break and start, peeling off. But what was interesting was seeing the Democrats that did peel off and ended up, voting with the party in power on making it happen. And the opposition, people are getting very, very mad at Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries for, um, being on the like just consistently, finding reasons to halt it. And so, as we look at the days coming by, we'll see what the plan of action is, because government shutdowns are never good for the party in power, and that mainly the executive power, right? I mean, the last times that this happened, um, this has had a deep impact, like deep impact on the last administration, even prior to that, going back as far as 2018 when the uh, government shutdown happened in, maybe not 18. It was either 18 or 19. But when the government was shut down on and couldn't agree on funding for immigration reform, or even securing, the border on the president's agenda, right? So there's just so many different things going on, um, and keeping consistent with it. And like, yeah, there's a bunch of like federal employees that are pretty much like lining up I think it was like 100,000 of the federal employees right now that are just thinking about resigning because they don't want to deal with this, right? They don't want to deal with like the long term impact of like, oh my God, is my job security at risk? I mean, they've already had several months of, I don't even know what's happening with Doge now, because we're just that's felt like a light year away. But the Department of Government Efficiency task force that was laying people off and was identifying waste, fraud, and abuse was like the first litmus test on getting a loyalty test out there. Elon Musk was sending emails to a bunch of people asking them about what they're working on. And so this is getting serious. Now it's like attacking the paycheck, right? And like now there's no funding for the government. And so this is kind of where we're at with that. But interesting to say, like this is one of the other hot button issues that were going on. Um, and then in response to some of the federal funding that's already kind of lined up for people, is these cities that were fighting back because they're getting their FEMA funding cut. They're getting all of their Department of Homeland Security grants cut because they're not adhering to the political ideology or conditions that are being leveraged upon them from the administration. So this is a problem. This is 100% a problem because now it's multiple cities all at once. There we go. So in California, Arizona, and Washington, there are several cities that are suing the administration over the executive orders that say imperil over $350 million for U.S. Department of Homeland Security grants to these local governments. And that includes FEMA funding, right? So the Trump administration has said it will not provide DHS funding to local governments unless they agree to support federal immigration enforcement, end programs that support diversity or provide benefits to immigrants that are in the country illegally, and comply with the president's other executive orders. The federal government has also threatened to criminally prosecute or claw back funds from localities that accept DHS money but do not comply with the new terms. So, like, this goes back to, early in the year, he was doing this with Columbia University. He was doing this with Harvard. He was doing this with university systems as a whole, right? If you don't adhere to the, mandated ideology of the federal administration and the guiding principles that they're trying to go through, and make everybody else follow, you're gonna lose your funding. And so now people are punching back. And so, like one of the Santa Clara County, which is in California, um, one of their special counsels said government shouldn't have to pass a political litmus test to be able to care for their communities. Correct. 100% correct. Like, with everything that's gone on this year, the scale of federal overreach, especially like in our space, it's been higher education and seeing where students have been getting affected by this. Right, we've had students who've had their visas revoked if they spoke out against Israel, if they were a part of pro-Palestine protests, right? And you know, it's just one more inch closer to authoritarian government, right? And it's like we're already well past the litmus test for that because it just keeps getting worse and worse. But these are the combination of things that are happening that ensure people are disenfranchised. People are disenfranchised. They won't have the funding they need to go and take care of localities. And I don't want to just identify problems, right? But like I think that even more so, especially from progressive minded folks, this is going to push more state and local governments to find ways to build their own revenue so that they can undertake this, and there's going to be less dependence on the federal government for all of these issues. But to see cities get involved inside of sort of coalition building to punch back is very interesting because the universities have done the same. They've kind of coalesced together, and so we'll see what's at stake, with those cities getting involved. But overall, I mean, these were some of the top three issues that were going on this week. Um, yeah, we have to be put in a position where we can, start putting ourselves and getting ourselves into the infrastructure of policy and just reversing everything that we can, right? Protect the homeland for us should mean our states and our counties and our cities, our homes where we actually grew up in. That's what we got to protect first. While other people are saying there's an invasion from within, they're really projecting when they're also leveraging the power that that federal government has to go and be put in our homes and in our backyards and in our streets. And we shouldn't be comfortable with it. We should not accept the fact that National Guards folks are going to be, sent into blue states because they disagree with the federal government. Right? Recently, I'm here in Nevada, and we've been taken off of our sanctuary jurisdiction. Do you know who even invented the idea of a sanctuary jurisdiction, sanctuary county, sanctuary city, sanctuary state? It was law enforcement. And the reason being was because law enforcement needed to still be able to protect citizens and undocumented folks from crime. And the only way to go and get undocumented folks to go to the police and report on crime was if they knew that they could go and do that comfortably without having to deal with immigration and naturalization services, ICE, right? And so it just goes to show you where what position we're in. Now, the political theater and the grandiose nature of needing to go and get all of your generals in the same room just so that you can talk about what's to come and like get them to think about putting ourselves in different cities to train because there's an enemy from within. That's projection. That is projection. And so the only equal and positive response we can do is to protect our homelands, which are our states, which are our cities and our communities. Right? And so it's time to get into that infrastructure, especially if you're a Gen Zer. Especially if you're someone who's already kind of, seeing the writing on the wall, you want to see a vision for how our country is going to go. It's time to put that vision in practice right in front of us. And so keep positive, keep thinking of ways to get plugged in. Um, we will still be here. And yeah, I'll see you this Friday, actually.